They were told to carry their crosses, but no one said which direction the nails should face. For 132 years, the hill outside St. Elijah's Monastery bore only inverted crucifixes. No one questioned them until the rains uncovered something. Beneath the soil, bones, bound at the wrists, all facing downward, and a journal too damaged to burn. The trees around St. Elijah's never grew straight, their trunks bowed slightly outward, as if repelled by the stone that stood in the high center of the clearing. Moss spread faster on the side facing east, but never touched the northern wall. The wind, even in spring, came bitter and dry, as if something beneath the ground pulled warmth inward. The monastery was founded in 1884, its blueprints archived in a now closed diocesan vault, called for a traditional Serbian Orthodox layout, an eastern-facing chapel, a refectory, dormitories, a small vineyard. But by the time the final stone was laid, something had changed. The chapel was turned 90 degrees. It faced north. No sunrise ever touched its altar. No natural light ever crowned the iconostasis. The morning bells, when they rang, were dull and slow, echoing off the surrounding hills like warnings rather than calls to prayer. And the locals noticed. They were German settlers, mostly timber families, quiet Catholics who lived along the riverbanks in single-room cabins. They didn't speak much to the monks. They didn't visit the hill, but over time, stories trickled down into the village, the kinds of things people whisper when they don't want to be heard by heaven. The monks of St. Elijah did not attend Mass in the daylight. They were seen only at dusk, walking the grounds in pairs, heads bowed, hands hidden beneath the folds of their robes. No one remembered seeing them eat or speak or gesture. They moved like men under water, slow, suspended, slightly off beat with the rest of the world. One woodsman claimed he saw a monk standing motionless in the trees at midnight, facing the chapel, not praying, just watching. The figure did not blink. When the man returned with lantern light, the figure was gone. Another family, whose property bordered the monastery's lower orchard, complained that each morning their crucifix had been turned upside down. At first, they blamed the local boys, but after the third week, they stopped attending church altogether. They sealed their door with a wooden plank and hung garlic from the windows. They were never seen again. The monastery never denied the rumors, but it never confirmed them either. No statements were issued, no explanations offered. Visitors to the hill, rare as they were reported, being greeted with polite silence, a silent bow, and nothing else. But something wasn't right by 1890. The trees closest to the chapel had begun to die in a perfect crescent pattern directly north of the apse. Birds refused to nest in the belfry. Even the iron bell itself, an 800-pound casting from Vienna, never rang above a whisper, no matter how hard it was struck. Local priests submitted quiet inquiries to the Archbishop's office. They were told to remain silent. The official explanation: the monastery was an experiment in monastic austerity, nothing more. But one seminarian, visiting from Pittsburgh, made note of something else. In a journal entry dated May 6, 1891, he wrote, "The chapel is darker than it should be. Even at noon, the windows allow no light, and the crucifix above the altar, it is reversed, not merely upside down, but its eyes are missing." That page was later torn out. Over time, a pattern emerged. Every crucifix on the grounds carved in wood, etched in stone, even painted in faded oil, was reversed. Some hung askew, others bore carvings of letters too faint to read, but all were turned. One traveler, a merchant from Bethlehem, recorded in his notebook, "The monks wear no icons, only ropes, coiled twice around the waist, with the ends tucked in. They walk as though counting something, but they never seem to finish." The ropes were later found buried. What troubled the villagers most wasn't the silence or the strange architecture. It was the timing. Every monk's appearance coincided with dusk. Their faces, when visible, seemed swollen by candlelight, stretched thin across high cheekbones, their eyes too reflective, their mouths unmoving, and when they prayed, it was never out loud. A hunter once followed one of them, at a distance through the orchard. He said the monk stopped, kneeled in the dirt, and began to move his hands, not in prayer, but in slow, deliberate patterns, as if tracing something unseen into the soil. The hunter turned away. He would not speak of what he heard next, only that it was not a voice, and not a word, but something old, something used to being underground. St. Elijah's was never condemned, never investigated. Over the decades, it simply receded from memory. Its presence on diocesan records grew fainter. Fewer monks were seen. By the 1920s, only 2 names were still listed in any church directory. Both were listed as caretaker, and both were marked as deceased. But the chapel remains still facing north, still untouched by morning light. And each spring, when the snow melts, fresh footprints are found around its foundation, bare, narrow, and always in pairs. The fog in October never cleared from the hilltop. Even by midday, it clung low to the grass, creeping up the stone steps like a silent congregation. The monastery's roof barely pierced the gray, its cruciform tower blending into sky and ash as though it belonged more to the clouds than to the earth. Deacon Petar Murkovic arrived just past the feast of the protection of the Theotokos in 1903. He traveled alone, sent by the diocesan vicar in Pittsburgh to investigate rumors, not of heresy, but of neglect. The reports were vague. Concerns about decay, abandonment, a lack of correspondence from the Brothers of St. Elijah. He brought no guard, only a small satchel of vestments, a worn Bible, and a letter bearing the archdiocese seal. By the time he reached the outer wall, he had already passed 2 graves sunken into the ground. They bore no names, only wooden crosses, each one weathered, crude, and inverted. He assumed it was error. The hill was steep, the wind sharp. No paths were cleared, only impressions in the grass, worn by years of slow, heavy feet. His boots sank into wet soil. The bell tower offered no sound. No one met him at the gate. Still, he entered. The monastery itself was silent, not abandoned, but unnaturally still. A kind of stillness that doesn't follow prayer, but replaces it. The first monk he saw did not speak. He passed along the inner corridor with a bowed head and a bundle of rope in his arms. His sandals were stained red, not fresh, not blood, but red from years of exposure, the kind that leaves no scent. Petar waited in the refectory, seated alone beneath a fresco of St. George that had peeled away from the plaster like sunburned skin. The eyes of the saint were missing, scraped clean, a pattern he would see again. They offered him no food, only water in a metal bowl. No words were exchanged, and when he finally stepped into the chapel alone, unescorted, already uneasy, he saw what he would later call the theological injury. Every crucifix, from the altar to the nave, was mounted upside down. Some were carved in stone, others painted onto wood or hanging from old brass chains. All inverted. Not damaged, not fallen, fixed. The largest, suspended above the altar, was 7 feet high, an iron corpus with no eyes. The crown of thorns had been recast as a loop of braided wire, barbed, not symbolic. Where the nails should have entered the hands, there were only rivets, welded shut. And beneath the inverted Christ, a small plaque, Latin, barely visible beneath years of soot, per damnationem lux. Through damnation, light. Petar did not complete the Mass. He left the chapel shaken, his rosary clenched so tight the beads cracked. He asked no questions. None were answered. That evening, he walked the grounds. He counted 20.7 grave markers behind the dormitory wall, all wooden, all unmarked. All upside down. Each bore the same rope pattern around its base. A figure. 8 loop, tightened once, tucked inward. It looked almost nautical, but Petar had seen the pattern before. In monastic burial rites. It was used for those who had died in penance, unabsolved, nameless. He returned to the guest cell and tried to sleep. The blankets smelled of wax. The floorboards groaned beneath unseen weight. And once, past midnight, he thought he heard footsteps. In the ceiling rafters, though there were no stairs above him. In the morning, he rose before the monks. He found his satchel moved, his Bible placed face down, and beneath it, a folded page. Face not the light directly. Turn downward, and he will follow. He did not wait for a final prayer. Petar departed before sunrise, the mist trailing him. Down the hillside like a veil, he said nothing to the monk who opened the gate, only crossed himself, and paused. Just outside the boundary wall, where the grass turned wild. He saw a final cross, staked into the earth with wire and nails, newly hammered, still damp with morning dew. No grave beneath it, just a blackened patch of soil, like something had burned through from below. It was inverted, of course, but more than that. It had been driven deep, too deep for shallow ground. Petar returned to Pittsburgh 2 days later. His letter arrived, 3 weeks after that, sealed in black wax, addressed directly to the bishop, and never opened publicly. An aide described him as visibly thinner, gray around the eyes. He refused to speak of the monastery, refused even to say its name aloud. He resigned from travel shortly after. His personal copy of the Bible, once bound in smooth oxhide, was found years later in the bottom drawer of a storage cabinet. The pages between Matthew and Revelation had been torn out, and in their place, a single sheet of onion paper folded 3 times. On it, written in his hand, there is a way to turn the cross, but you must turn yourself first. It was never explained. And the letter? It remains sealed in the diocesan archives, stamped twice, and marked with one word, inverted. The old recordings from Ashwood Hollow carry a faint hiss-like wind through. Dry grass. Photographs from the 1910s show weather. Warm faces turned away from the lens. Men with hollow eyes, women holding their children too tightly, and children who never smiled. All gathered outside St. Elijah's Chapel, silent, still, and looking downward. They were the parishioners, timber cutters, stone carriers, fruit. Pickers, settlers from the old countries, Serbs, Ruthenians, Hungarians, simple people who worked hard and spoke little. But after St. Elijah's was founded, they stopped speaking entirely. At least not in the way most remembered. They whispered, not just in the chapel or during Mass, but everywhere, on the roads, in the shops, in their homes. Entire conversations conducted as if afraid someone or something might overhear. A schoolteacher in 1911 wrote to her sister in Scranton, even the children have begun to murmur their prayers. I've not heard a full voice in weeks, not even when they fall or fight. It's like the louder they speak, the more it hurts them. No official doctrine was ever written. No papal directive, no monastic policy. But within a year of St. Elijah's opening its doors, the entire community around it adopted a kind of enforced silence. They called it reverence. But something wasn't right. Mass. St. Elijah's followed an unfamiliar pattern. Parishioners were permitted only to enter the chapel one at a time. No communal pews, no choir, no shared homily. Each person would enter alone, kneel, and exit without making eye contact. It was not a procession. It was a rotation. Local oral history recalls a woman named Dorothea who once broke this rule, stepping inside while another parishioner remained at the altar. She returned moments later, pale and shaking. She never returned to church. When asked what she'd seen, she bit her tongue until it bled. She died weeks later of a fever that no doctor could diagnose. No one else ever interrupted the pattern. Again, and then came the matter of the monks. They were never spoken of directly, not by name, not even by title. In confession, some would refer to them as the others. Others called them the Watchers, but most simply said nothing. A priest assigned to the parish in 1915 recorded only a single confession that mentioned the brothers. He asked me why the rope was tighter this time. I told him it wasn't mine to loosen. The priest left the parish 3 months later. His replacement refused to take residence near the chapel, instead performing his duties from a converted storeroom half a mile down the road. But it wasn't just fear or reverence. It was something more precise, more practiced. Visitors reported that even children as young as 4 or 5 seemed to know the rules. They did not run near the chapel. They never touched the door. And when a stranger approached, they'd press a finger to their lips, not as a game, but with wide, urgent eyes. As though silence was not preference, but survival. One former altar boy speaking decades later in a nursing home described the feeling inside the chapel. It was never quiet, not truly. You could hear your breath, your blood, but underneath it, like between the walls, there was something else, something moving. I learned to hold my breath during prayer. It made it easier not to hear it breathe back. He would not elaborate. When asked if he remembered the monks, he simply shook his head and began whispering the Lord's Prayer backward. The phenomenon came to be known years later as the silence of the Ashwood Doctrine. Not a written rule, but an understood one, passed down in behavior, reinforced by fear. It spread beyond the chapel. Homes closest to the monastery stopped using bells. They removed wind chimes, caged their dogs. Even the clocks were muted, faces removed, hands stopped. A midwife named Amelia claimed that babies born near the chapel did not cry until their 3rd day. She kept that detail to herself, because by then, people had begun to notice something else. The more they spoke of the silence, the harder it became to break it. Throats would tighten, jaws would lock. One man's tongue reportedly split during a homily after accidentally naming one of the monks aloud. He left the village soon after. His house was boarded shut. Windows painted black, but the parishioners kept coming. They kept filing in, one by one, kneeling at an altar they could not name, praying to a Christ turned upside down. And when they spoke at all, it was only in the confessional. And even there, only in whispers. A single surviving note from the priest's journal in 1919, preserved by accident in a bundle of diocesan invoices, reads, "I cannot absolve them, because they do not confess sin, only obedience, only silence. And I fear, have done the same." By 1920, the parish had dwindled. Some families left, others faded, and the chapel's doors began to stay closed more often than not. But those who remained whispered still. Even now, in Ashwood Hollow, some of the oldest residents will pause before speaking near the ill, even if they no longer attend, even if they no longer believe. They say the habit never quite leaves, and when asked why, one woman offered only this: because when the chapel listens, it listens forever. The chapel door never creaked, no matter how slowly it opened. The hinges, blackened with age, moved without a sound. Only the cold followed, a kind of deep ... set chill, not from the wind outside, but from the stillness inside, as if air itself refused to settle within the walls of St. Elijah's. In the winter of 1922, a third ... year seminarian named Alexander Krug was sent to the monastery for observation. He was bright, fluent in liturgical Greek, disciplined, quiet. His instructors praised his humility, though some noted he spoke too softly to be clearly heard. Others found his handwriting difficult to read, always slightly slanted, and darker on the downward strokes. Alexander arrived just before Advent. He was to stay 1 month. The Archdiocese framed it as retreat spiritual preparation before formal ordination. But unofficially, he was meant to observe the liturgical practices of the monks. There had been questions, fragments of reports, liturgies held outside canonical hours, confessionals built without partitions, crosses again, inverted. But he wasn't told any of this directly, only that the monastery was exceptional in its austerity. He was received in silence. 2 monks greeted him at the gate, robed in black, with deep cowls drawn low across their sea. Faces. They nodded, but did not speak. Alexander bowed in return and followed Dot inside. The chapel smelled of wax and old dust. The air was heavy. He was given a cell near the refectory and instructed by gesture alone to remain inside after sundown. Meals were delivered through a narrow wooden hatch. No words, no prayers. The first 3 nights passed uneventfully. He read from the Psalter, transcribed a passage from Thessalonians, marked his days with charcoal on the cell wall. But on the 4th night, just after midnight, he woke to a sound he could not explain. A low, rhythmic hum. Not a voice. Not quite. Music, a tone, layered upon itself. Moving slowly, like breath caught in stone, he dressed quickly, stepped into the corridor. The air was colder than before, and the hall, usually dark, glowed faintly from the chapel at the far end. He followed it. Each step grew heavier, though not from fear, from pressure, like walking downhill through water. The humming grew clearer, not louder, just more present, and that's when he saw it. The chapel doors were slightly ajar. He pressed them open and stepped inside. Dozens of monks stood within, robed, motionless, their backs to the altar, each positioned in precise rows, shoulder to shoulder, facing the nave. Not the altar, not the cross, but the doors. Him. None. They hummed in unison, low, pulsing. The tones were familiar, but off. Tempo. The Kyrie, he thought at first, but reversed, drawn backward like a breath never meant to be exhaled. Leksandar did not move. Not at first. He watched, frozen, as one monk raised a hand slowly toward his own chest. The motion suggested the sign of the cross, but it was done backward, left to right, forehead to heart, then down, to the throat. And all around him, the others began to mirror the motion. Silent, synchronized. And facing away from the altar. There was no priest. No celebrant. No chalice or gospel book. Only the monks. And the sound? A liturgy with no speaker. Only breath. He stepped back. The door groaned, just once, beneath his hand, and the sound stopped, all at once. The humming ceased. The monks did not move, but one near the front lowered his hand to his, sighed, slowly, deliberately. And that was when Alexander saw it. The fingers were broken, bent back at unnatural angles, knuckles bruised black, nails missing, as though they had been pressed into something for far too long. Still, the monk did not turn. None of them turned. Alexander stepped away from the door. He walked the corridor without looking back, entered his cell, closed the hatch, and sat unmoving until morning. He did not eat the breakfast left for him. He left that afternoon. The monks did not stop him. They opened the gate, bowed in silence, and watched him go. He did not write of what he saw until years later, in a personal journal kept hidden beneath a false floorboard in his family's home. It was found after his death in 1979. One passage, written in ink, faded to rust, reads, "It was not a mass, because there was no offering, no communion, only a mirror held up to something we shouldn't have looked into." Alexander never returned to seminary. He requested release from his ecclesiastical duties the following spring. No explanation was given. The church granted it, and his name was quietly removed from the ordination records. But what he did next confused even his closest friends. He stopped attending Mass, stopped speaking of theology. And most notably, he refused to speak the words of the liturgy out loud. For the rest of his life, Alexander prayed only in silence, mouth closed, eyes downward, and when asked why, he would only whisper, "Because I don't know who listens anymore." Snow had melted. Late that year, by April 1947, the soil around St. Elijah's had turned to a thick, black clay cold to the touch, even beneath sunlight. Cracks had begun to spread across the chapel's stone base, long, jagged lines reaching up from the foundation toward the nave wall. At first, the monks said nothing, but by mid-May, Part of the nave floor had begun to sag. It was subtle, just a dip in the stone underfoot, but enough that the crucifix above the altar had begun to lean, ever so slightly, toward the apse. They called a crew from Steeple and Sons Restoration out of Clearfield, a 3-man team, 2 laborers and a structural inspector. The company had repaired church foundations across western Pennsylvania for nearly 3 decades. They had never heard of St. Elijah's. Their truck arrived just before noon. The gate was open for them, but no one spoke. The monks, now few, are in. Number 4, maybe 5 only, nodded and gestured. Not a word exchanged, not even to the foreman. The workers noted the cold immediately, not just outside, but within. The air inside the chapel felt raw, weighted, as if whatever was below, the stone, was pulling heat inward. They set to work beneath the nave. The plan was simple: remove part of the warped floor, check the supporting beams, and pour concrete if necessary. But when they began lifting stone, they found something unexpected. There was no support beam. Just dirt. Soft, packed earth beneath 5 inches of cut stone. That in itself was unusual, but not impossible. Many old chapels were built quickly, without deep reinforcement. They continued. Within the hour, the ground beneath the center of the nave gave way. It didn't collapse. It opened. A perfect circle 6 feet across, its edges smooth, impossibly clean. Not cut, not cracked, just opened, as if something below had been waiting for the weight to shift. One of the workers, a man named Harlan Simons, leaned over the edge with a flashlight. He saw no bottom. Only black. He dropped a nail into the opening, counted 7 seconds before it hit something. Not stone, not water, just a dull thud. And that's when he heard it. Low, faint. A hum. At first, he thought it was his ears adjusting to the silence of the place, but the others heard it too, a kind of droning. Not mechanical, not wind. Chanting. Wordless, layered, multiple tones coming from beneath the earth. They didn't stay long after that. The crew packed their tools. Quiet, shaken. One man new to the company refused to re-enter the building. He sat in the truck with the engine off, sweating despite the cold. They filed a report that afternoon, brief, clinical. It noted an unexplainable subterranean cavity and auditory anomalies inconsistent with geological echo. But it didn't mention the smell. Harlan would later tell his brother, off the record, that just before leaving, he caught a scent rising from the shaft. Not sulfur. Not rot, but incense. Old, faint, like something burned long ago. And never stopped. The monks gave no explanation. They thanked the crew without speaking, only bowed, and within a week had sealed the hole with stone. But it didn't settle. A local surveyor, sent months later to confirm structural stability, noted that the nave floor remained slightly bowed, a depression no more than 3 inches deep, exactly where the shaft had been discovered. He recommended a complete excavation. Permission was denied. Church officials in Pittsburgh closed the file, but Harlan never forgot it. In a letter dated 1953, addressed to a priest he had once worked with, he wrote, "I keep thinking about what was underneath. We were there at noon, full daylight, and yet it felt midnight, like something had flipped the hours, something that didn't want to be seen." He died 2 years later. And the chapel? It remained open, but from that year forward, no one was permitted to walk beneath the nave, not even the monks. The handwriting was thin, and angular, each line pressed into the page as though carved with intention, not ink. The parchment was brittle, kept folded beneath the lining of a split leather binding, hidden inside a damaged copy of the Appalachia Patrum, found only after the chapel had closed its doors for good, and it wasn't signed, just titled Reversio, on the grace that fails. The pages were fragmented, some soaked through, others burned along the edges, as if scorched deliberately. But the central idea repeated itself again and again, in Latin first, then Old Serbian. To undo the fall, one must undo the form. Where God builds upward, we descend. The path to salvation lies not in light, but in inversion. The text offered no context, no authorship, but it matched the handwriting found in an earlier confession log, dated 1904. That monk's name was erased, but something wasn't right. There were pages 12. In total, it seemed copied again and again, always slightly different, always redrafted, as if someone were rewriting doctrine from memory, only backward. Passages from Matthew rewritten right. Left. The Nicene Creed fragmented and reversed, line by line. Even the sign of the cross diagrammed, annotated, not in the usual way, but mirrored. A diagram showed the gesture being drawn from heart to head, then from shoulder to shoulder, ending not in the name of the Father, but in a final symbol that appeared to be scratched out, not overwritten. Scratched out, as if it could not be named. The document came to be known as the Doctrine of Reversal, an unofficial, unrecognized theology that surfaced only once in church records, cited briefly in a failed excommunication trial in 1932. Its core principle was simple: undoing grace. Where ordinary ascetic practice seeks to resist sin, undoing grace seeks to unravel sanctity, not heresy in the usual sense, not denial, but reversal. One section reads, "If sin is the bending of truth, then holiness is the rigidity of it. But if God was made flesh, then flesh must be undone to return." It is believed the monks of St. Elijah followed it, though no one ever confessed it aloud. The signs were small, subtle, at first, only noticeable in their fasting calendars. Days meant for celebration were marked instead as days of abstention. Major feasts were crossed out, in some cases rewritten as mirror dates celebrated not on the 25th, but the 52nd, a date that does not exist. Then came the prayers. Witnesses described monks reciting litanies that did not match the known canon. Same cadence, same rise and fall, but the words were off. One priest described hearing a psalm he'd known since childhood, but in reverse order. When he asked, the monk only smiled and said nothing. Another letter, found decades later in a diocesan archive, recalled an incident in 1928. A visiting bishop had attended St. Elijah's during Lent. He noted the chapel silence, the inverted crucifix, and the absence of a Eucharistic host. He assumed it had not been consecrated, but as he prepared to leave, he noticed something carved into the wood beneath the altar cloth. Hoc non est corpus meum. This is not my body. The words were traced in #. He never returned. The deeper record suggested a hierarchy within the monastery, a pattern of descent. The longer one stayed, the more inverted their practices became. Novices would recite standard prayers, fast during expected seasons, remain silent as instructed. But full brothers, they reversed all signs. They stood when others knelt. They placed icons face down. And some, according to a single unsigned note, would write their confessions backward, fold them, and bury them beneath the chapel floor. In the dirt. Next to the shaft. A former groundskeeper interviewed once before his death described seeing something strange one night. A monk in the orchard, just before dusk, walking in a slow circle with a hand. Mirror held to his chest. He wasn't looking into it, the man said. He was showing it to the trees. That was in 1949. The man was gone by spring. Others remembered seeing bread left to rot instead of wine. Ashes used to mark the feet instead of the forehead. And perhaps most disturbing, the slow disappearance of names. The monastery's last known registry listed only titles: caretaker, penitent, watcher, rope. Bearer. The names themselves had been crossed out. When one brother died in 1955, his grave marker bore only a symbol, a simple spiral, etched into stone with no birth date, no cross. And no conclusion. One theologian, reviewing the recovered doctrine in the 1980s, wrote, "They believed the fall was not a single act, but a direction, and to rise again. One must fall harder, not sin, but descend into the hollow shape of grace, until even God could not follow." His paper was rejected from publication. Today, the parchment remains sealed in a vault in Johnstown, Pennsylvania. No copies allowed. And the chapel still stands. The doors have been shut for decades. Locals report that each spring, just after the thaw, new patterns appear in the grass around the chapel foundation. Circles, spirals, figure ... 8's. 1 year. A series of words ... half ... buried were found beneath the nave window. Unto us that we may begin. They were erased before photographs could be taken, and no one has seen who carves them. The fire moved faster than the trees should have allowed. It began on the northern edge of Ashwood Hollow, sparked by a lightning strike just after midnight. By dawn, it had spread nearly 2 miles south. Local fire crews worked through the morning, but winds shifted the blaze toward the ridge above the chapel. They assumed the building would be lost, but it wasn't. When they reached the grounds late that afternoon, they found the trees surrounding St. Elijah's blackened, reduced to pillars of soot. The chapel itself, however, stood untouched, not a stone out of place, its roof intact, its door still closed. But something had changed. The flames had stripped the grass to ash, burned the brush away, and in doing so, revealed what should have never been uncovered. Rows, dozens of them, rough wooden beams, each about 4 feet tall, protruding from the scorched earth. At first glance, the responders assumed they were grave markers, old crosses, blackened by age and smoke. But then someone looked closer. The crosses weren't just charred. They were upside down, and beneath each one, the dirt was disturbed. Not buried, not deep, just disturbed, like something had been placed there, and covered quickly. A call was made to the county coroner. Deputies arrived within the hour. Tape was placed, photographs taken. And then came the digging. The first site was shallow, only 6 inches below the surface. A layer of pale bone, small, fragmented, was uncovered. The sheriff paused the excavation and requested a forensics team, but one of the firemen, curious, walked further out toward the southern field. He counted 17 more crosses, all inverted, all evenly spaced, and in the center of them, a circular patch of earth, burned deeper than the rest. He didn't touch it, not then, but something wasn't right. By the next morning, 40 ... 7 crosses had been identified, each buried inverted, each with a small mound of soil beneath it. No caskets, no stone, just dirt and bone, and the smell of old smoke. Then the coroner made his statement. Animal remains, possibly livestock, improperly disposed of. But those who had seen them disagreed. One local deputy, a young man named Calder, had knelt beside the third excavation pit. He noted the length of the femur, the shape of the pelvis. He didn't say it out loud, but he knew these weren't animals. They were small, too. Small. He sent a private request to a forensic pathologist at the University Hospital in Altoona. The sample returned quietly, in a sealed envelope with no cover letter, just a tagged human. Approx. Age 6 to 8. Healed fracture on right tibia. No further analysis was requested. No charges filed. The sheriff closed the file within 72 hours. The case was sealed. Officially, no evidence of criminal activity. Remains confirmed to be non-human. Grounds restored to diocesan control. But that wasn't the end. Over the next 3 weeks, strange accounts emerged from those who had worked the fire. One of the firemen reported waking in the middle of the night to the smell of incense, strong, bitter, filling his home. When he walked into the kitchen, he found ashes on the floor, arranged in the shape of a cross. Inverted. Another Calder himself was hospitalized, briefly after suffering what doctors called a stress reaction. He had stopped eating, refused to leave his bedroom. When questioned, he said only, "They weren't buried. Not really. they were placed, waiting. He refused to elaborate. 2 years later, he left law enforcement and disappeared. Journal entries from another responder, an EMT, named Marianne, mentioned voices. Not at the site, not at the hospital, but later, weeks later, in the shower, just before the water hits, a sound like humming, coming from the drain. She moved to Florida in 1973. Left no forwarding address, but perhaps the strangest discovery came not from the fire itself, but from the soil. A geologist, privately hired by the county 2 months later, took samples from the southern field. He expected to find typical post-fire degradation. Instead, he found layers of ash inconsistent with forest fire residue. Older, compressed, and streaked with traces of oil, and BESWAX. As if the ground had been burned before. Deliberately. Repeatedly. The site was never consecrated. No markers were placed. The crosses, what remained of them, were pulled and disposed of. Some said they were burned. Others claimed they were stored beneath the chapel. No record confirms either, but the field has remained bare ever since. Nothing grows there. No birds nest in the trees nearby. And when the wind shifts through Ashwood Hollow, there's a sound not quite music, not quite voice. Low. Layered. Moving up from beneath the earth. Locals don't speak of it anymore, but once, years after the fire, a former groundskeeper broke silence in a bar outside Dubois. He'd helped shovel ash, clear brush, restore the boundary fence. When asked what he remembered most, he didn't speak at first. He just traced a small spiral into the condensation on his glass. Then whispered. They weren't buried, they were planted. The light in room 6C flickered, but the bulb never went out. It pulsed, steady, slow, as if mirroring breath. No one replaced it. No one knew how long it had been flickering. Inside, the walls were bare. No icons, no curtains, no crucifix, just a single chair bolted to the floor, and a bed no one ever slept in. His name on paper was Anselm, though it wasn't the name he used. He never gave one. He'd arrived in October of 1986, transferred from a rural hospital in Cambria County after suffering what doctors first called a dissociative episode. Found wandering the eastern woods near Ashwood Hollow, robes torn, hands bleeding, eyes red from exposure. He wouldn't speak, wouldn't eat, but he laughed. Soft, inconsistent, as if he wasn't laughing at something, but remembering it. When admitted to the facility, he was catalogued as nonverbal, resistant to stimuli, high risk of harm to self and others. But he never attacked. He simply sat upright, in the chair facing the wall. Whispering. They thought it was gibberish, but one nurse, whose father had been a priest, recognized a few of the words. Latin, Psalms, recited backward, fragmented. The valley of the shadow leads unto no rod. Another staff member noted that his eyes never blinked during recitation. He would speak, pause, then tilt his head, as if listening for response. None came, until someone made a mistake. A meaning volunteer brought in a wooden crucifix from the chapel across the street. Small, upright, simple. She entered room 6C. Placed it gently on the edge of the bed and waited. At first, he didn't react. Then, slowly, his head turned, eyes wide, unblinking, a grin stretched across his face, and then he laughed. Not loud, not hysterical, but full deep from the chest. Each chuckle punctuated by a gasp of air, as though something inside him found the image of the cross. Unspeakably funny. The volunteer left in tears. A few hours later, Anselm spoke, just 3 words. It's upside down. Then silence. It wasn't clear whether he was correcting her or the crucifix. That moment marked the beginning of what doctors referred to as his lucid window. Over the next 9 days, he spoke sporadically, never answering questions directly, never initiating conversation, but offering fragments. Always the same tone, calm, reverent, like prayer. He waits beneath the chapel, a face with no blessing. We laughed, so we wouldn't listen. They recorded everything, transcribed each phrase. Most made no sense. But one set of words spoken on the third night caught the attention of a visiting psychologist from Pittsburgh. Anselm had said, "When the bell rings 3 times backward, the eyes open, and they never close again." There was no context, no elaboration. Just that later, during a standard neurological exam, he was shown a series of religious images, icons, rosaries, stained glass. He ignored them all until the final card and image of Christ crucified, traditional, upright, rendered in gold leaf. He smiled and wept and whispered, "That's not the face I saw." They asked him to explain. He looked at them directly for the first time and said, "The one beneath the chapel smiled first." We only followed. That night, staff reported hearing music from his room, not from a radio, not from any source they could identify, just soft, rhythmic humming, low, repetitive, a pattern of 4 tones. Then silence, then 4 again. A nurse entered to investigate. Anselm sat motionless, eyes closed, mouth slightly open, but the sound didn't stop, and it wasn't coming from him. It was coming from beneath the floor. They checked for plumbing. HVAC. Nothing. No one entered room 6C. The next day. By morning, he'd stopped speaking. He tore at his skin, removed his fingernails, traced patterns on the floor using blood and saliva. Not words, not symbols. Just spirals, over and over. When sedated, he muttered only one sentence never written down in official reports, only passed verbally from orderly to orderly. It wasn't buried. It's just waiting for someone to call it by name. By December, he was transferred to a long term facility in Erie. No visitors. No correspondence. His records were sealed in 1991, but a former staff member, a night nurse, now in her 70s, keeps a note in her Bible. A line Anselm whispered to her during his last week at the facility. She never told anyone, never wrote it down. Until recently, folded between the Psalms, in faded pencil. When the last monk forgets how to pray, the face will speak again. The seminary ledgers from Pittsburgh are crisp to crisp, thick pages, carefully typed, margins aligned, names listed by date, diocese, and rank. And then gaps. Rows where a name has been typed, then erased, not crossed out, not redacted. Erased. The paper remains, the imprint faint, but something once written there is gone. Between 1950 and 1990, at least 6 names vanish in this way. Each corresponds to an ecclesiastical investigator, men handpicked by the archdiocese to assess rumors of deviant theology, of unsanctioned rites, of doctrine that turns the cross upside down. They were sent to St. Elijah's. None returned. Officially, no one went at all. But that wasn't true. A Freedom of Information request filed in 2004 revealed partial correspondence between the archdiocese and a now dissolved Vatican Subcommittee Congregatio de Disciplina Extraordinum, a body tasked with reviewing irregularities in clerical comportment in North America. The first letter is dated March 17, 1951. Concerns have arisen regarding liturgical divergence and potential isolationist practices at the St. Elijah Monastery in Ashwood Hollow. We request canonical inspection under episcopal silence per Article 9. It bears a crimson seal. No reply is archived. But in April of that year, Father Mauro Benedetti, professor of sacramental theology, missed his first lecture in 17 years. He was listed as on sabbatical. He never resumed teaching. His room at the seminary was emptied by staff, his belongings boxed, labeled, and stored. No forwarding address. No family listed. He was never mentioned in faculty rosters. Again, in 1963, another letter, this time more urgent. A second report describes inversion not only of liturgical symbols, but of doctrinal sequence. There is reason to believe the monks of St. Elijah have developed a theology of uncreation. They refer to it, cryptically, as undoing grace. Please advise. Again, no reply, but records show that in June of that year, a young priest father, K, departed from Rome on ecclesiastical passport, destination listed only as Private Monastic Review, Western PA. He was 27. And had published a paper on inverted metaphysics the year before. His name does not appear in any seminary registry after 1964, and that's when something changed. Beginning in the 1970s, requests ceased to name the chapel directly. The location was instead referred to as Domum Obscurum, the Dark House. Internal memos referenced anomalous architecture, altered somatic practice, and behavioral silence among clergy. One document handwritten reads, "Language dissolves in the presence of the nave. Those who speak forget. Those who forget pray differently." By 1980, the correspondence had stopped entirely, but in 1986, an anonymous letter reached the Apostolic Nunciature in Washington. D.C. It consisted of just 9 words. He smiled at me from the floorboards. It was never attributed. And no action was taken. Then came the audit. In 1992. Following a larger investigation into clerical misconduct across multiple dioceses, an independent researcher was granted limited access to the Vatican's archival index for anomalous properties. He found no mention of St. Elijah's, but he did find something else. A folder, sealed in red wax, labeled inverter. Inside, a single sheet of VELLUM. No letterhead, no signature. Just a line of text. The foundation must not be excavated. It is not earth beneath it. No additional documentation. The folder was gone by the next week. Today, no official record exists confirming the church ever visited the site, but 6 different men, each ordained, each assigned to the region between 1950 and 1990, vanish from all clerical logs after their scheduled trips. None are buried under their rare baptismal names. None were declared dead, and none were replaced. One file, heavily damaged by water, appears to contain a scanned memo from 1975, its margins torn, its ink bled. Only a few words remain legible. We thought we sent inspectors, but it welcomed them as acolytes. One survivor and archivist from the diocesan office in Greensburg spoke off the record in 2009. He'd helped catalog old reports, filed travel logs, shuffled photos and expense documents into folders no one asked for again. When questioned about St. Elijah's, he nodded. And said, "They came back, but not as themselves." He refused to explain. Said only that one of the visitors, an older priest with trembling hands, had walked into the diocesan chapel 2 weeks after returning, stood before the crucifix, and whispered, "It's facing the wrong way," then collapsed. He was transferred to hospice that afternoon, died 2 days later. His file, like the others, was never completed. Only a final note scribbled in the margin of a personnel form, now lost to time. It read, "The face beneath the nave is not content with silence. It is teaching them how to listen differently. The hill doesn't show on most maps. It rises subtly, behind a narrow split in the tree line east of Ashwood Hollow. No road leads to it. No sign marks its presence. But if you follow the air cooler, drier, sharper than it should be in summer, it draws you upward. The grass grows differently there. Short, brittle, pale at the root. It doesn't sway with the wind. And in the center of the clearing, something else. Wood, not new, not rotten either. Rough, hewn, dark, angled into the soil. Leaning. Crosses. Crude, uneven, some nailed, others bound with rusted wire or stained twine, all of them pointing downward. Inverted, no names, no symbols. No explanation. Locals call it the turning ground, and they don't go there anymore. One man did. His name was Lyle Tarrant, land surveyor, contracted in 2016 by a development firm, hoping to rezone the eastern woods for private lots. He was skeptical of the stories, didn't believe in local folklore. On June 8th, He set up drone equipment to begin topographical scans. He didn't even get the first flight. The drone lifted, hovered, then spiraled. Not fast, just wrong. The controls didn't respond. The feed went dark. It dropped shattered against the soil. Right at the base of the tallest cross. Lyle retrieved the pieces, packed up for the day, returned 2 days later with a second drone. This time he launched from farther out 60 meters away, just beyond the northern tree line. Same result. The drone lost signal at exactly 30.3 feet above the hilltop. Then fell. No visible interference. No magnetic anomaly on the reader. Just silence. And then collapsed. He switched to ground scans, walked the perimeter, noting slight depressions in the soil around each cross, as if something had been dug up or buried shallow. That evening, he marked each one with a small red flag for reference. 12 in total. He returned at dawn the next morning. Flags were gone. The crosses had shifted. Not all of them, just 3. Exactly 180 degrees, facing down. As if something beneath the earth had rotated them. Lyle brought a crowbar, removed 1, tossed it to the edge of the clearing. It snapped in half before it hit the ground. Not from the throw, from something else. The break was clean. Cold. He kept going. One by one, he removed the crosses, loaded them into the back of his truck. Photographed the site, now empty. He left and returned 3 days later to finish the scan. All 12 had reappeared. No footprints, no tool marks, no sign of disturbance. Just their. As they had been. Downward. Fixed. Lyle didn't report it to his supervisors, but he did something strange. He began to dig, not out of curiosity, out of what he later called obligation. He felt it in his jaw, his teeth, the pressure, like something calling not in sound, but in weight. It took him most of the day. 3 feet, then 5. The soil grew darker, cooler. At 6 feet, his shovel struck stone, not bedrock. Carved. He uncovered a single slab. Rounded at the edge, pocked with small indentations, repetitive, deliberate, a design of some kind, worn nearly smooth. He brushed away more dirt. Found a seam, then a groove. Running inward and downward, a stairwell. He stopped there, didn't enter, didn't document. He covered the site, replaced the soil, replanted the grass, but something wasn't right. He returned home, resigned from the project, and left the state. 2 months later, he was institutionalized following what physicians called a lucid psychological break. He could speak, but chose not to, except once. To a visitor, his sister, he whispered. It wanted a way back up. She didn't ask what. Only when. And he smiled, not gently, not sadly, just knowingly. That hill remains untouched. No permit has ever been approved for construction near it. Wildlife avoids it. Even birds refuse to land. And every few months, without pattern or warning, the crosses turn. Sometimes slowly, sometimes overnight. Always downward, and just once recorded by a camera. Hidden among the trees, a shape was caught in frame. Not clear, not detailed. Just the suggestion of motion. Just past the edge of the hill, moving toward the center, and pausing. Before facing the camera, and vanishing behind the frame. The footage was corrupted soon after, but the final frame remains. A blur of brown cloth, and what might have been a face, or might not. Lyle's sister keeps it in a drawer, folded behind a Bible she no longer opens. On the back of the photo, in pencil, a single line: the cross turns itself when we forget to watch. The crosses are not symbols anymore. They are instructions, left behind by a sect that believed heaven must be broken into by descending in reverse. No one watches. St. Elijah's Hill, no. But something still remembers which direction the nails were supposed to go. Next time, what the children of 9 rosaries remembered before they vanished.